Douglas MacArthur, born 1880, died 1964. Follow along with me in your American Experience book beginning on page 293. Duty, honor, country. Those three hallowed words reverently dictate what you ought to be, what you can be, what you will be. They are your rallying point to build courage when courage seems to fail, to regain faith when there seems to be little cause for faith, to create hope when hope becomes forlorn. Sylvanus Thayer Award acceptance speech to the cadets of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York, May 12, 1962. Given his life as a dedicated advocate for peace and freedom, it seems appropriate that Douglas MacArthur was born on a military base. Ever since, he sought ways to serve his country militarily, doing what he believed was right, even if it meant losing his position. In 1903, Douglas graduated from West Point Military Academy with honors and went into the Army Corps of Engineers. In the First World War, Douglas became a colonel and led the 42nd Rainbow Division, nicknamed for its diversity. The men in this division came from all over America. After World War I, Douglas was appointed Army Chief of Staff, charged with keeping the Army professional and effective during the Great Depression. 5 years later, President Franklin Roosevelt sent Douglas to the Philippines to establish a military force. When the Army wanted to bring Douglas home, Douglas insisted that his work in the Philippines was not finished. He resigned from the Army to stay and help Philippine President Manuel Quezon. After being called back to active duty, Douglas played notable roles in both World War II and the Korean War. In the Second World War, Douglas worked in the Pacific, trying to ward off Japanese advances. He personally accepted Japan's surrender in 1945 and stayed in Japan to monitor peace and restoration. In the Korean War, as commander of the United Nations forces, Douglas demanded that the United States acknowledge China as an official part of the war until President Truman relieved him of command. Douglas spent his later years chairing a company called Remington Rand, which made typewriters and early computers. The following excerpt is from Reports of General MacArthur, Volume 1, The Campaigns of MacArthur in the Pacific, Chapter 8, The Lafayette Operation. Strategic value of Lafayette. The Lafayette operation was to be the crucial battle of the war in the Pacific. On its outcome would depend the fate of the Philippines and the future course of the war against Japan. Located in the heart of the archipelago, Lafayette was the focal point where the Southwest Pacific forces of General MacArthur were to converge with the Central Pacific forces of Admiral Nimitz in a mighty assault to wrest the Philippines from the hands of the enemy. With Lafayette under General MacArthur's control, the other islands would be within effective striking distance of his ground and air forces. Lafayette was to be the anvil against which he would hammer the Japanese into submission in the central Philippines, the springboard from which he would proceed to the conquest of Luzon for the final attack against Japan itself. Military necessity demanded that the Allies achieve a decisive victory on Lafayette. General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz were committed to employing the maximum resources at their command. It was axiomatic, too, that the Japanese would fight to the bitter end to save the Philippines. The war situation had grown progressively worse for Japan, and by the autumn of 1944, her position was both critical and desperate. No longer were the Allies held at the outer periphery of her defense system. They were now poised with their full power at the very threshold of her inner structure, and if they should break through, the homeland itself would stand dangerously exposed, an inviting target for the next invasion. With the initiative entirely in Allied hands, the war had reached that decisive stage where another important Japanese defeat would seal the ultimate fate of Japan's empire and destroy century-old traditions of invincibility. The Philippines would probably offer the last chance for the Japanese army to recover its lost prestige and gain a victory over General MacArthur's forces. To achieve this victory, the Japanese battle fleet would undoubtedly come forth in full strength to throw back all invasion efforts. If the Japanese were to realize the rapid diminishing hope of stemming the surging American tide, the decisive battle would have to be in the Philippines. The alternative of failure would be inevitable defeat. The decision had to be pressed. Clearing the Leyte Gulf. The plan for the ground operations in the capture of Leyte comprised 4 main phases. Phase 1 covered minor preliminary landings to secure the small island lying across the entrance to Leyte Gulf. Phase 2 included the main amphibious assaults on Leyte from Dulang to Tacloban and called for the seizure of the airstrip, an advantage through Leyte Valley, and the opening of San Juanico and Panoan Straits. Phase 3 consisted of the necessary overland and shore-to-shore operations to complete the capture of Leyte and the seizure of southern Samar. Phase 4 contemplated the occupation of the remainder of Samar and the further neutralization of the enemy positions in Visayas. The first landings to mark the invasion of the Philippines were made on 3 small islands which guarded the eastern approaches to Leyte Gulf. Despite cyclonic storms and heavy seas, implements of the 6th Ranger Battalion, augmented by 1 company of the 21st Infantry, went ashore on Suluan and Dinganat Islands on 17 October 1944. Heavy mist shrouded their approach, and they were opposed only by the rough surf and battering winds. Hamonhon Island was occupied the next day. All 3 islands were quickly cleared of small enemy garrisons and radio installations, while minesweepers and demolition teams cooperated to sweep the waters and the beaches of all obstacles potentially dangerous to the main operation. The return of MacArthur. On the 20th of October, the largest mass of naval assault craft and warships ever concentrated in the Pacific sailed boldly into Leyte Gulf. The landing beaches and tactically important rear areas had already been softened by a continuous 2-day ship and plane bombardment. After an additional morning barrage, the landing troops were ready to go ashore. The main assault on the east coast of Leyte began at 10 o'clock in the morning with landings along an 18-mile front between 2 small villages of Dulang and San Jose. 10th Corps, comprising the 1st Cavalry and the 24th Divisions, covered the right flank of the landings to the north. 24th Corps, consisting of the 7th and 96th Divisions, secured the left flank. Both shores of the Panoan Strait at the southern tip of the island were seized by a single regimental combat team, 21st Infantry, which had gone ashore an hour prior to the main assault. General MacArthur's stirring promise to return to the Philippines was fulfilled shortly after the main landings. In a drenching rain, he strode ashore on the muddy beachhead near Palo, following close to the assault's echelons, and heralded the coming hour of liberation. Speaking to millions of waiting Filipinos over a portable radio set, he declared, "This is the voice of freedom, General MacArthur speaking. People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil consecrated in the blood of our 2 peoples. We have come dedicated and committed to the task of destroying every vestige of enemy control over your daily lives, and of restoring upon a foundation of indestructible strength the liberties of your people. At my side is your president, Sergio Osmena, worthy successor of that great patriot, Manuel Quezon, with members of his cabinet. The seat of your government is now therefore firmly re-established on Philippine soil. The hour of your redemption is here. Your patriots have demonstrated an unswerving and resolute devotion to the principles of freedom that challenges the best that is written on the pages of human history. I now call upon your supreme effort that the enemy may know from the temper of an aroused and outraged people within that he has a force there to contend with no less violent than is the force committed without. Rally to me. Let the indomitable spirit of Bataan and Corregidor lead on. As the lines of battle roll forward to bring you within the zone of operations, rise and strike. For future generations of your sons and daughters, strike. In the name of your sacred dead, strike. Let no heart be faint. Let every arm be steeled. The guidance of divine God points the way. Follow in his name to the holy grail of righteous victory. Leyte in retrospective. The battle for Leyte demonstrated to a greater degree than ever before in the Pacific War the coordinated striking power of the American land, air, and naval team. Despite heroic efforts and great courage, despite the use of unprecedented numbers of ships, planes, and troops collected from all parts of their fast shrinking empire, the Japanese were unable to stand before the overwhelming drive of American combined arms. The Japanese suffered irreparable defeat in the Leyte campaign. Every phase of their ambitious show plan for the defense of the Philippines met with complete and irretrievable failure. Driven to near panic by the threat of losing the Philippines, Japan's wartime leaders in Tokyo had risked their remaining offensive power in one last effort to save their empire. Whatever chance the Japanese had to regain the initiative in the Pacific was lost on Leyte. In the largest and most widespread sea battle in history, Japan's naval power had been smashed. The losses sustained by the Japanese fleet are among the most staggering on record. After Leyte, Allied warships could sail with impunity anywhere in the Pacific. Japanese air power as an organized force also was destroyed in the Philippines. The employment of planes and suicide tactics not only reflected an extreme shortage of aircraft and trained personnel, but also revealed the desperate plight of the minds that manipulated Japan's war strategy. The kamikaze was the last fierce sputter of a burned-out and dying air force. On the ground, General MacArthur's troops met the enemy for the first time en masse, with armies and corps pitted against each other in comparatively free maneuver. The Japanese, determined to retrieve their position at any cost, dispatched troops from China and Manchuria and from all corners of the Philippines to the Leyte battlefront. Paralleling their performance in New Guinea and in the Solomons, the Japanese yielded nothing without a bitter fight, and it took daring and skillful maneuver on part of the American soldier to pry them out of their well-prepared positions or break up their desperate counterattacks. All enemy efforts, however, proved in vain. Their movements were anticipated, their divisions decimated, and their troops forced to flee, starving and demoralized, into the hills and mountains of inner Leyte. General MacArthur's victory on Leyte was decisive and final. Once more, General MacArthur had caught the enemy off balance and had gained the decisive advantage of tactical surprise. The Japanese had anticipated an invasion of the Philippines, but they did not know when or where the blow would fall. They were especially unprepared on Leyte. The speed with which the great convoy was unloaded and the rapid drive inland surprised and confused the Japanese. In spite of having been consistently outmaneuvered in New Guinea, the Japanese apparently learned little about the strength and versatility of the American ground, air, and naval machine. The Japanese failure on Leyte was also due in great measure to deficiencies in their procurement of intelligence, and by the same token, Allied success owed much to a superior intelligence organization. The enemy's piecemeal efforts to reinforce Leyte compromised his Luzon defense plan and drained the southern Philippines of combat strength. The cost to the Japanese in their reinforcement attempts was enormous. American air power crippled Japanese convoys, and while some troops were able to make sure, the bulk of combat material and supplies was often lost. Strong reinforcements did arrive at Leyte, but so great were the losses involved that General Yamashita's staff eventually accepted the view that an effective defense of the Philippines or even of Luzon alone had become impossible. The Japanese resolution to fight the decisive battle in the Visayas had come too late. The battle for Leyte brought other valuable lessons into sharp relief. Although past operations in the Pacific had demonstrated what could be accomplished with controlled air power, Leyte showed how lack of aerial supremacy at a critical juncture could change the whole complexion of an operation. The definite need for the establishment of a forward air base in the early stages of a campaign was revealed more clearly in Leyte than in any previous operation. In the European theater, bombers could operate from the same fields over long periods of time in view of relatively short flight distances. But Southwest Pacific air units seldomly stayed in one locality more than 2 months before they had to establish new fields 300 to 500 miles away. Consequently, Pacific operations demanded mobile and flexible tactic air combat teams that could transfer their base of operations at a moment's notice to keep pace with the rapid forward strikes of General MacArthur's ground forces. The weakness in offensive air power in the early phases of the Lafayette operation was directly attributable to the adverse weather and difficult terrain. A combination of continuous typhoons, heavy rains, poor drainage, and thick silt formations made it impossible to condition forward airfields as rapidly as the growing scope of the campaign demanded. The Japanese could therefore carry out their initial reinforcement program with comparative success. As a result, United States ground forces met increasing numbers of enemy troops, and the successful conclusion of the battle was prolonged beyond schedule. The Lafayette operation emphasized the inherent risks of divided command. In the naval action, two key American commanders were independent of each other, one under General MacArthur and the other under Admiral Nimitz. Both operated in the same waters and in the same battle. Divided command affected the Allies primarily in the sea fight for Lafayette Gulf, but it also ran like a cancer throughout the operations of the Japanese armed forces in the Philippines. The Japanese defeat on Lafayette brought American forces almost to the China Sea, placing them in a position to sever the sea routes connecting Japan with her empire to the south. This menace to the safety of her sea lanes drastically reduced the volume of traffic between Japan and her conquered territories. With access to her resources in the Netherlands, East India, and Malaya in danger of being completely cut off, Japan's hopes for successfully continuing the conflict were rapidly diminishing. General MacArthur had kept his faith. His return to the Philippines was a dramatic and singular fulfillment of historical destiny. A year before the assault against Lafayette, his forces had been deep in the tangled jungles and swamps of New Guinea, almost 1,500 miles from the Philippines. Now he had led them into the very heart of the island, into a position to become masters of the archipelago. On the third anniversary of the Japanese attack against the Philippines, General MacArthur's forces were organizing the final blows which would lead to the capture of Manila and the surrender of General Yamashita's troops on Luzon. The dark shadow of defeat was edging ever faster across the face of the rising sun of Japan. The hour of total eclipse was not far off. Important notes and vocabulary. Note 1 found on page 295. Lafayette, which I have discovered I have mispronounced, should be pronounced Leyte. It's an island in the Philippines. Note 2, archipelago, a group of islands. Note 3, Admiral Nimitz. Admiral Nimitz was a U.S. commander and also from Fredericksburg, Texas. Note 4, anvil. Anvil is a large wedge against which hot metal is hammered and shaped. Note 5, Luzon. Luzon is the biggest island in the Philippines. Note 6. Axiomatic means natural, assumed, taken for granted. On page 296, note number 7. Amphibious, having the ability to transform from sea to land or vice versa. Note 8. Dulag and Tacloban, two Filipino cities. Note 9. San Juanico, a strait between two large eastern Filipino islands. Note 10. Panano Straits, a strait between two islands south of the San Juanico Strait. Note 11. Samar, a large central Filipino island on the eastern side. Note 12. Visayas, the central of three island groups in the Philippines. Note 13 is found on page 297. It is an original footnote that reads, "The severity of this bombardment accounted in great measure for the initial ease of the Allied landings. In addition to forcing the enemy from many of his beach entrenchments, it seriously disrupted his entire communication system." General Tomochita stated, "The positions of the 16th Division Artillery Regiment along the first line of defense were subjected to a severe pre-landing naval bombardment, which resulted in the destruction of a great number of its field pieces. Regimental radiotelegraphic communications were disrupted by this bombardment, and direct communications with the 35th Army and with the 14th Area Army Headquarters in Manila were never reestablished. Direct liaison between regiments and smaller units of the division could no longer be carried out effectively. 10th Information and Historical Service, HQ 8th Army, Staff Study of Operations of the Japanese 35th Army on Leyte, Part 1, hereinafter cited as 8th Army Staff Study, Leyte. Note 14, barrage. In military terms, a protective or defensive barrier of artillery fire. Note 15 is found on page 298. Palo is a city in Leyte. Note 16, echelons. A military formation of parallel rows, arranged like stair steps. The front row would be the shortest, the backmost row the longest. Note 17 is an original footnote found on page 299. It reads, General MacArthur's radio broadcast, the 20th of October, 1944. Note 18 is found on page 300. Kamikaze, a Japanese aircraft loaded with explosives whose mission was to crash into the enemy and detonate, also killing the pilot. Note 19, en masse, or also pronounced en masse. It is French for in a mass or in a group. Note 20 is another original footnote that reads, the following is a brief historical resume of the enemy divisions which were engaged in the fighting on Leyte. The Japanese 1st Division from Tokyo area was shipped directly to Leyte from Manchuria in November 1944 and was decimated in the northern Ormoc corridor. The 68th Brigade came to Manila from Formosa in December 1944 and was trapped on the west coast in the Palopon, San Isidro area. Elements of the 8th Division were committed in the Valencia sector, where they were destroyed or driven into the hills. Note 21, New Guinea. New Guinea is a large island just north of Australia. Note 22, the Solomons. These are islands east of New Guinea. Note 23 is found on page 301 and is another original footnote that reads, the swift inland drive of the U.S. forces caught the Japanese unawares. We had thought, said General Tomochida, that the Allies, after landing, would try to secure their beachheads before proceeding with their advance. However, the enemy rather caught us off guard with their tactics of immediately starting their penetration inland, even before their newly won beachheads had been secured. Interrogation Files, G2, Historical Section, GHQ, FEC. Note 24, procurement. Procurement means attainment, gathering, seeking out. Note 25 is another original footnote. It reads, in a staff study dated 20th of September 1944, Japanese Imperial General Headquarters stated, the enemy has detailed information of our troops' distribution in the Philippines. Concerning intelligence operations in General Tomochida, he declared, American intelligence was so far superior that a comparison is useless. It seems to me as if we were fighting our battles blindfolded, while the enemy seemed to have 10 times the intelligence we possessed. Major Kazo Taguchi, 14th Area Army Staff Officer, acknowledged that the lack of an effective intelligence system and the ultimate failure to surmise correctly the mobility and speed of the American forces and the time and place of their actual landing attempts was one of the 3 major Japanese mistakes. Said Colonel Kobayashi, we had no inside information on American pre-invasion preparations. From shift movements and radio message traffic count, we could estimate the probable site of landings. By past tactics and strategy, we were able to estimate the force, the method of landing, and the time to some extent, but we had no other intelligence. Interrogation Files, G2, Historical Section, GHQ, FEC. Note 26 is found on page 302. Piecemeal. Piecemeal means formed gradually, the effect of being a little mismatched, incongruous, or ineffective. Note 27. Yamashita's. He is a Japanese Army general. Note 28. Relief. To bring something into relief is to make it noticeable, undeniable. Note 27. European theater. The area of Europe where World War II fighting occurred. I apologize for any mispronunciations during the recording of this section of the book.